Yeah, my name's Alex Huth. I'm a newly associate professor in the departments of computer and neuroscience at UT. And my lab works on understanding how language is processed in the brain. So this is kind of our big motivating question that I'm going to parlay into doing some kind of brain-computer interface work. But the process that we're interested in here, the kind of language processing process, is somebody says something. I'm saying things right now. I'm taking ideas and I'm putting them into words. These words are being turned into vibrations in the air. You are hearing these vibrations. They're getting converted into neural signals. These neural signals are entering your brain. A bunch of processing happens, some fun stuff. And what should pop out at the other end, hopefully, is an idea that resembles whatever the idea was in my head when I started speaking. Right? So this is maybe the goal of communication here, is to take ideas from one brain and put them into another brain. And kind of big picture, we want to understand this process. And I don't think we're going to get there, I don't know, in my lifetime and career, but hopefully we can chip away at it a little bit and see some fun things. So how do we do this? How do we get at this kind of big process? In my lab, we take a pretty different approach than a lot of scientists who study speech or speech processing or language processing. We try to kind of see language as it's used in real life. So what we do is we basically do one experiment in my lab. All my students work with data from more or less one experiment, which is just having people listen to natural language. We take subjects, we put them inside an MRI scanner, and we play them stories. That's pretty much it. That's our whole experiment. They're natural stories. They're stories selected from radio shows or podcasts. The kind of main source for this is the Moth Radio Hour. Have any of you heard the Moth? It's good. It's like really good stories, right? So our subjects love this. They're engaged. They're excited to listen to these stories. They pay attention. They don't fall asleep most of the time, which is pretty cool for MRI studies. Like that's hard. I've been a subject in a lot of MRI studies. I've spent hundreds of hours inside MRI scanners, and this is by far the most fun experiment that I've done in MRI. I'm one of the subjects on whom we've collected a lot of data. That's one of the nice things about this paradigm, because it's this natural speech that's not painful and boring to listen to. We can get people to go back in the scanner again and again and again and again. For the subjects where we have the most data, we have more than 20 hours of data from each subject's brain. So we have them go back in the scanner. I think we have up to like 24 sessions now on a single subject. In each session, they listen to a little more than an hour of stories, so many, many, many hours of data from an individual subject's brain. And while they're listening to these stories, we are recording this measure of brain activity, the bold signal from fMRI, continuously over the entire brain. So every 2 seconds, we get a new picture of their whole brain and kind of how it's responding at, not quite at this moment, but how the blood oxygenation and blood flow are changing the brain at this moment, which probably reflects neural processing happening a few seconds ago. All right, so this is our experiment. Our experiment is largely kind of hypothesis-free, in a way, right? We are putting people in the scanner and having them listen to stories. This experiment doesn't embody a specific hypothesis, right? There's no hypothesis built into how we design this experiment. So how are we using this to actually do science? That's all going to come on the analysis side, and like how we take this data and analyze it and try to figure out what's happening as the brain is processing this incoming language information. And to do that, we use this technique that was really developed for studying vision, but we've adapted to language, and it's been very successful here, which we call language encoding models or voxel-wise encoding models. So let me walk through this for you, and let me see if my mouse will show up. Beautiful. OK, it's kind of a little, whatever. OK, so we have the story stimuli that the person is listening to. They come in. They go into the person's brain, and we get these responses. In each little voxel, each little chunk of brain tissue that we're recording the fMRI signal from, we have a response time course. Right? That's how did this voxel respond over time. Now for each sort of moment in the story, what we're going to do is we're also going to extract some kinds of features from that piece of the story. All right? And this is where the kind of hypothesis comes into our method. This is where our scientific question kind of becomes crystallized. It's not in the experiment, it's in this generation of the models that we're going to use. There's many different things that we could do here, right? So for one example, we might have the audio that the person is hearing broken down into frequencies, right? So just like a spectral analysis of the audio. This would be one kind of hypothesis for what the brain is representing. We might figure out what are the phonemes that they heard at each moment in time. This is a different kind of hypothesis about what information is being encoded in Cortex. A lot of my graduate and postdoc work was on doing this kind of thing, but with word embedding vectors. So we take each word in the story, convert it into a word embedding using kind of standardized techniques. This is, let's see. This is something that's became quite popular a little more than a decade ago with things like word2vec. It worked pretty well. We can see a lot of things. But whatever kind of features we use, what we're going to end up doing is we have this vector of features at each point in time. And then we're going to model the brain response as just a weighted sum of these features. Right, so we know what R is here. We know what X is. That's the features that we extracted from the stimuli. And then we're going to use all this data that we collected, these 20 hours of data, to fit these parameters, these betas. There's linear weights. This is linear regression, standard, normal thing. We can then test these models. We can use them to predict responses to new stories that weren't in our training set. We can measure how good those predictions are, and I'm not showing you those results here, but they end up being very good in many cases. We can predict with very high correlation the response time courses of voxels all over Cortex. It's kind of shocking the extent of Cortex, which is actually responding to some of the content in language. It's everywhere in a very real and interesting way that I'm happy to talk about if you have questions. But OK, so let's turn our attention here a little bit to this question of what kinds of features should we use? Like what's the, what gives us maybe the best models or the most useful models in some way? And one specific thing has really emerged that has beaten everything else, which is neural network language models. All right, so this is things like GPT, what is the core of ChatGPT, which you are all, of course, familiar with. So the idea here is the words that the person is hearing, we give those to the language model as well. We have this big neural network model. We feed it words. It's sort of reading the words as a person is hearing the words. And then we extract from somewhere deep in the middle of that model how it's representing this piece of language, how it's representing the sequence of words that it's heard. And then we use those as the features to predict brain activity. This works very well. This works almost shockingly well. Like instantly when neural network language models came on the scene 6 or 7 years ago, we started doing this, and it just beat the pants off our earlier word embedding models. Everything else that we had done was kind of thrown by the wayside, and this became the mainstay of how we model brain responses to language. So this has now become a pretty popular thing. Leila Wahebi, who's a close collaborator of mine, I think was the first person to show this before language models became a popular thing at all. So that was pretty exciting. I think my student Shaylee Jane and I had the first paper on this in fMRI back in 2018. This is pretty much exploded in the language fMRI field. There's many, many groups doing this now. And a lot of people are seeing the same thing, that these neural network language models are very, very good at capturing how the brain represents language. Let me tell you one story here first about sort of how we use this to study the brain, and then I'm going to tell you a second story about how we use these models to do something else that is also exciting. So, of course, if you are familiar with neural network language models, you will know that they are scientifically kind of black boxes. We don't know exactly what they're doing. We don't know how they're doing the things they're doing. We don't really understand what their representations mean, what kinds of rules they're following when they're processing language. There's been a lot of work on kind of pulling these things out of language models. In a lot of ways, it's much easier to study an artificial neural network than it is to study a brain. You can completely observe what's going on inside it. You can manipulate what's going on inside it and see what effect that has. So there's kind of better tools for studying that, but it's still, we don't have a complete understanding yet. So maybe given that these models are kind of black boxes, how can they help us understand language representations in the brain? And can they help us understand how these representations are organized across different parts of Cortex? Now, this is work done by my former grad student, Shaili Jain, who's now a postdoc in Eddie Chang's lab. I'm going to show you just a tidbit of this because I think it's exciting, and then it'll motivate the next thing we do. So how do we use this? We have a model for one little piece of brain tissue, for one voxel. It's this big, high-dimensional model, hundreds of dimensions of weights that are feeding off of this neural network model with 100 million weights inside it. How can we tell what this is actually doing? What is this little piece of brain doing? So what Shaili did was she found a way to try to summarize this information. So what we did was we built this big library of phrases, of 10-word phrases, because that was what our model was kind of basing its predictions on. We get 140,000 phrases. And then we push these all through our encoding model. So we predict how this little piece of brain would respond to each of these 100,000 phrases. And then we can sort them. So this is just showing for one particular voxel, one random little chunk of brain tissue, the predicted response across these 140,000 different phrases. We know that this is pretty robust. If we bootstrap our model fitting by choosing different subsets of training data, we get slightly different orderings. That's actually what the kind of error bounds are showing here. But which are the best phrases, which are the ones that activate this voxel the most, that's pretty robust here. Okay? So we can use this, we can then look, we can say, what are the best phrases? What are the things that actually drive this piece of brain tissue? I'm just going to show you one example because I think this is a very surprising one, not necessarily one that I think many linguists or like neurolinguists would have guessed that you have some piece of brain that seems to be devoted to. So here's one little chunk of brain. It's in the medial frontal cortex. What you're seeing here is a front view of one person's brain. So this is in the right hemisphere. The different parts of the brain here are colored according to vaguely their selectivity. So we're looking at one little piece of brain tissue right here. And these are the phrases that drive this piece of brain tissue most. And I've highlighted the last word because that's kind of like the moment at which we're reading the features out of this phrase. So it's we're kind of seeing the last word in the context of the previous words. So this little piece of brain tissue, it really likes these phrases like motioned for me to sit next to him and thanked me, started to ask the lady a question and she said, excuse me, and she comes out and she says, look, I'm really sorry. You should probably go in there, go check in there, so I say thanks. So these are all different words. You see me show up a couple times, but they're all really seemingly examples of somebody being polite. We have this little chunk of brain tissue that really likes it whenever you hear somebody being polite. When you hear somebody thanking someone else or saying, I'm sorry, or excuse me, any of these kinds of things, this little piece of brain tissue, it likes that. It turns on. Its activity goes up. And again, this is just this was surprising to us. This wasn't something that we expected to be there. This wasn't something, I mean, it's certainly something that we know that we can analyze, that we can understand from language. But the idea that you would have a little chunk of brain tissue that actually seems to represent this function of like, is this thing polite? Is this thing that you're hearing somebody say, like, does this represent this kind of social information? This was exciting to us. So I'm not going to show you more examples of this, but we can do a similar thing across many different voxels in the brain. We can summarize this information in various ways. And we have some interesting work in progress that Shaili's still finishing up, where we're looking at the sort of organization of cortex in terms of this kind of information. So what I've kind of shown you here, I've convinced you of, is that we can see kind of detailed selectivity in different parts of the brain using this kind of approach. So given this, let's try to do something else. Let's try to do the reverse of this process that I just talked about. All right? So the models I described to you a moment ago, we call those encoding models. They go from the stimulus and they predict what the brain response is going to be. Can we go the other way around? Can we take the brain response and predict what the stimulus was? This is a decoding model. Right? This is all going to be work done by my former grad student, now postdoc, Jerry Tang, who is just fabulous at this kind of thing. Okay, so right, we have the encoding model that goes from stimuli to brain. Decoding model goes from brain to stimuli. We're going to frame this in a kind of probabilistic way. I'm going to show you one more bit of equation here. Decoding is finding the most likely stimulus given the response. Right? So we might think of this as there's some probability distribution, the probability of stimulus given response, and we're trying to find the S that maximizes this. Right? We have some R that goes into the model, and then we're trying to find the S that has that's the most likely, the most probable given this response. It turns out that directly building a model of this is very hard. Nobody has succeeded at doing this for language fMRI yet. This is a hard problem. The details of why are maybe like a little peculiar, and it has to do with the temporal structure of fMRI, where what we're measuring is this much mushier, nastier signal than what Chetan was just talking about with spikes. Spikes are beautiful, they're fine in time, they're precise, you really see what each neuron is doing. In fMRI, we're seeing this blood oxygenation signal that after a burst of neural activity, it rises for a few seconds and then it falls for a few seconds. So in every moment of sort of fMRI signal that you read, you're actually seeing some kind of integration sum over the last, 10 seconds of input, which is maybe 30 or 40 words. How can you disentangle this? Directly modeling this ends up just being a very nasty problem that, again, nobody has actually solved successfully. But there's a really good way to do this, it turns out, that was developed by a former lab mate and collaborator of mine, Shinji Nishimoto. This is called Bayesian decoding. All right, so the other equation I'm going to show you here, this is Bayes' rule. If we want to get this probability of stimulus given response, this is the thing that we want. Bayes' rule tells us that we can swing things around. We can reframe this as this product of the probability of the response given the stimulus and the probability of the stimulus. Normalized by the probability of response, but we don't care. That actually doesn't matter for our purposes. Right? And it turns out that these two things, P of R given S and P of S, we already have them. We have very, very good models for these things. P of R given S, this is our encoding model. Right? Probability of response given stimulus. This is just the model that predicts the brain activity from the stimuli. There's a little twist on it that we have to fit that captures dependencies among the responses, maybe similar to what Chetan was talking about. But more or less, we have this already. Probability of stimulus, this is just a neural network language model. We have very good versions of these days. It turns out this is a very much kind of a solved problem for our purposes. So we're going to combine these two things to try to read out what somebody is hearing. So practically, the way that this works, it looks like this. We have a language model, P of S. In this case, it's GPT. And what I'm going to show you, it's GPT-1, the granddaddy of ChatGPT. Great-granddaddy, something like that. So our language model is essentially just going to guess words. It's going to tell us, like, we think this is the last word a person heard. What words might come next? And the language model is going to give us some possibilities. Right? So, for example, if we think the person might have already heard, I saw a dog, the language model might say the next words should be like with or and. So I saw a dog with or I saw a dog and. It tells us that these are reasonable continuations. Now, given some set of possibilities, like this I saw a dog with, I saw a dog and, we can evaluate, using our encoding model, what would the brain response have looked like if the person had actually heard these words, right? So we get a prediction of what would the brain response to I saw a dog with or I saw a dog and look like. And then we can compare those to the actual brain response, and we can say which one's a better match. Okay? So if we have many of these possible kind of continuations here, we can sort these according to which ones seem most likely, given the brain responses. We throw out the bad ones, keep the good ones, and then just repeat this process by guessing new words that come next and evaluating those guesses. How well does this work, you might ask? Let me show you some examples. These are some examples from our paper. On the top here, this is a little snippet of an actual stimulus. This is one of the moth stories that one of our subjects heard. It said, I didn't know whether to scream, cry, or run away. Instead, I said, leave me alone. I don't need your help. And the decoded version here is started to scream and cry, and then she just said, I told you to leave me alone. You can't hurt me. So certainly, this is far from perfect, right? So there's missing information, run away is gone. I don't need your help is gone. The model somehow confabulated this you can't hurt me. It's in the same realm of things you could imagine. This is something somebody might say if they were saying the sentence, but it's not words that actually came out. Notably, the model really stinks at getting like agent and pronouns correct. So I said became she said. Somehow pronouns, information about pronouns is just kind of suppressed at the scale that we're looking at with fMRI. We don't see a lot of signature of it, so the model has a hard time guessing this. But surprisingly, the kind of overall gist is preserved. And in this case, even specific phrases, specific words are actually exactly decoded, right? So scream and cry, leave me alone, we're able to really like actually recover this from the fMRI signal. This, I gotta say, when we got this working, this was shocking to me. You just saw examples that Chetan showed of language being decoded from these implanted electrodes where it's perfect. People actually get every word correct. I think a lot of people would have said a couple years ago, there is no way in hell you're going to be able to do that with fMRI. Like, that is not going to work. You just can't get it. The signal is too slow. It's not there. So the fact that we were able to recover things even to this level, I think was a surprise to us. Let me show you another example. Here the actual stimulus was, I don't have my driver's license yet, and I just jumped out right when I needed to, and she says, well, why don't you come back, yada, yada, to my house, actually. And then the decoded version is, she has not even started to learn to drive yet. I had to push her out of the car. I said, we will take her home. Now, we get these kind of surprisingly, again, the gist preserving matches. I don't have my driver's license yet. She has not even started to learn to drive yet. Jumped out, push her out of the car. Jumped out is actually referring to somebody jumping out of a car. That's not confabulated here, but what actually happened here is a miss. We get a lot of exact word matches. Like I said, the car was something that it actually correctly inferred, even though whatever that wasn't in the original. But what you can see here, the thing I want to highlight is, this is still approximate in how well it matches, but evaluating this actually ends up being a bit difficult. So I don't have my driver's license yet, and she has not even started to learn to drive yet. There's one word in common between those two things. It's the word yet. And yet, they mean pretty similar things, right? I haven't started to learn to drive yet. I don't have my driver's license yet. These are exchangeable phrases. So evaluating this actually ended up being one of the big problems that we had to spend a lot of time messing around with on this paper. Because our model seems to be it's not getting every word, but it's getting this kind of gist. It's recovering the meaning without recovering the words. We have a very high word error rate, so it's above 90%. It's significant, but who really cares? That doesn't matter. Other kind of surface form-oriented metrics like BLEU and Meteor, which are kind of standard metrics for machine translation, these are, we're above chance on these, but they're not fantastic. But then we have this other metric here, which it's called BERT score. This is a more modern, like neural network-based metric that's supposed to evaluate, do two pieces of text mean the same thing, even if they're using different words? And according to this metric, we're doing very well. We're something like 20 standard deviations above chance, which, I don't know. Even a physicist would say, like, that's pretty good, right? So this is still kind of evaluation is a messy thing, but it seems to be working quite well. Okay, so I showed you that we can do this while a person is listening to a story, right? This was data collected while a person was hearing a story. We can reconstruct what the words were. What if they're just thinking a story? How do we do this? How do we get at this? This ended up being a bit of a hairy sort of experimental thing. We can have somebody just think, and we can decode that, but how do we know if it's the right thing or not? So what we ended up doing was we had our subjects memorize a few short segments of stories, like 1-minute segments of stories, practice telling them a few times. We recorded them telling these segments a few times so that we knew kind of, they got pretty consistent. We knew roughly what words they were going to say and when. And then we put them right in the MRI scanner and did the same thing, but they didn't speak out loud. They just thought the stories. And it turns out that this still works. It doesn't work as well as listening, but we still get something that is way, way, way above chance. Here's some snippets. So the imagine story part is, this is what the subject had practiced saying. I looked for a message from my wife saying that she had changed her mind and that she was coming back. The decoded version is, to see her for some reason I thought maybe she would come to me and say she misses me. The imagined story was coming down a hill at me on a skateboard, and he was going really fast, and he stopped just in time. And the decoder version is he couldn't get to me fast enough. He drove straight up into my lane and tried to ram me. Close. And this last one, the imagined story, was I went on a dirt road through a field of wheat and over a stream and by some log buildings. And the decoder version is he had to walk across a bridge to the other side and a very large building in the distance. So you can see it's not just like decoding the same thing each time. It's clearly getting something that's capturing actually what the person is just thinking in this case. OK, so we can do this while somebody is listening to a story. We can do it while they're thinking a story. Let's take one step further. What if there's no language involved at all? What if we just have somebody watching a video? OK? So we tried this. We had our subjects watch videos. We plugged this data into our language decoder as if it was language. This model was never trained on somebody seeing video. It has not seen the brain seeing. That is not something that's in this model's repertoire. But when we plug it into the decoder, this is what it pops out. So I'm going to show you the video here and the transcription on the bottom. I'll read that out loud for you. So be so sad, she said, I know you did it for me and for you. She then took my hand and held it to her lips. She kissed it. I smiled, and she pulled me in for a hug. I got her back for about hours. I had to stop the bleeding and gave her my shirt to put over it. It missed some important things. This is a baby dragon. It didn't say that at all. Notably, all of our stories are actually true life stories. There's no like fantasy stories. So the idea of a dragon is really outside this model's kind of whatever its understanding. But it's pretty clear that it's actually recovering what the person was seeing here. It's kind of narrating what was happening in this movie, which means that what we're getting at here is maybe something pretty deep. We're getting at like the meaning of what the stimulus is that's coming in, and not really the words. Which also makes sense with what we see with the fact that we're able to get something that matches the gist, but not the exact words. Right? We're getting at the meaning and not the linguistic structure. Hang on, I'm actually going to skip a thing here. OK, so right, this works surprisingly well on language perception, imagined speech, and these non-language stimuli. This means that we have this overlap of vision and language. But let's talk about some limitations here. So it currently requires a pretty big fMRI training set. So for all of the examples I showed you here, these were decoders that were trained using about 16 hours, not our full data set, but about 16 hours of data per subject. That's a lot of time to spend inside an MRI scanner. If this is going to be something that people use for some purpose, that makes it hard. These semantic models, they have to be trained on language perception data, right? So on people actually listening to language, which if this is something that we maybe want to use to help people, maybe to help people who have language impairments, as in aphasia, then maybe language perception is going to be not totally preserved, so this might be hard for patients like that. And finally, of course, this is using MRI scanners, which are not exactly practical for everyday use. It's a multi-million-dollar machine that sits in a multi-million-dollar facility. It weighs several tons, has a few $100,000 of liquid helium inside it. Like this is not something you're going to have at home, right? So let's see if we can address some of these limitations. Are these fundamental? So let me first talk about avoiding model training. Can we get away with not training this model for a person? So we've tried anatomical co-registration. So just taking data from one person's brain, kind of mooshing it, morphing it until it matches another person's brain. This stinks. This does not work. It works on very kind of large-scale, blobby things. Like you can get some overlap that's not terrible. But for this kind of fine, detailed stuff, right? Like this single voxel that likes when you hear a polite phrase, that's not going to map exactly onto the single voxel that likes polite phrases in the other person's brain. Like that's just not going to happen. So kind of anatomically aligning brains, which is a standard MRI practice, that does not work for our purposes. But functionally aligning brains, so functional co-registration, actually is pretty promising. So let me describe what we're doing here. So within participant, this is the model that I was just describing. We have all this training data that we use to fit our model. We have some test data. We use the model to decode the test data. We get a result. Right? We've come up with this approach. We've adapted this approach from a lab that developed it. This is from Yuki Kamatani's group, who developed this for doing visual decoding, but it's been very effective for our purposes as well. They call this the converter approach. So what we're going to do is, on one subject, we're going to collect our training data as usual, and we're also going to collect a little piece of data we call the converter training data. This is much smaller than our full training set. It might be language, it might be something else, but just some little piece of functional data, maybe half an hour, maybe an hour of data, not 16 hours. On another subject, we're going to collect the same converter training data, so the same stories or same stimuli, whatever, and then we're going to collect some test data as well. But we don't have the 16 hours of training data on this new subject. Then we're going to fit what we call a converter model. So this model is going to take data from participant 2 and try to predict the response in participant 1. All right, so project from one subject to the other. Literally just linear regression. That's all we're doing. Very simple. Nothing fancy, no like manifold alignment, although it is, of course, like ostensibly kind of manifold alignment, yeah. Literally just linear regression from this subject's brain to this subject's brain gives us a model that projects data from here to here. Then we can take the test data, project it into this subject's brain, and then decode it using their decoder into a result. All right, so we still have to have some training data here, this small amount, but it's a lot less than the 16 hours of training data that we have over on this side. So how well does this work? It gives us a pretty big boost over training within subject. So this is showing language-based converter, so we're training it on responses to stories, as the data I was just talking about. The gray dots here, the x-axis here is how much training data we use from 8 minutes up to 256 minutes. The gray dots are showing if we just train the model within a subject. This is decoding performance on the y-axis. And the blue dots are showing how well it works if we do this converter approach. So you can see that for very small amounts of data, it works quite a bit better than actually fitting the model within a subject on that small amount of data. At some point, it kind of crosses over. With the full data set, we're still sort of below the performance of the full data set here, but we're definitely getting a boost from doing this converter thing. But the cool thing about this is that we don't have to use language to do this. So we also collected data from our subjects while they're watching a bunch of movies, and they're silent movies. These are actually Pixar shorts that we used, which are nice because they have no language. They explicitly have no language in them. We used a bunch of Pixar shorts, and then we used that to align the data from one subject to another, and then use that alignment to decode language. So we never had to collect language training data from our new participant at all. No language training data, just this movie data. Right? So this is totally applicable in people who have language dysfunction. And what you can see here is that we're doing about as well as we were on the language side at decoding language using this converter approach. We can also try to fit like a within subject model, but that just doesn't work very well on the movies. So this is promising. This means that we can use less data than before. We're still trying to make this better, and we think we can, but it doesn't seem like it has the same data requirements. And we can use this totally different modality, right? So we can use movies instead of language to train this model, probably because they're kind of accessing the same underlying semantic meaning representations. Yeah, so we think this is important for aphasia. The last thing that I noted as a possible limitation of this approach is using fMRI. We're also trying to address this now. So we started a collaboration with Joe Culver's group at WashU, who does what's called DOT, diffuse optical tomography. It's essentially fancy FNIRS, functional near infrared spectroscopy. You use infrared light, many infrared sources and detectors on the scalp to reconstruct a 3D map of blood oxygenation inside the brain. This has a big advantage over fNIRS, this more classical approach, because you can kind of factor out the signal from the scalp, which ends up actually really contaminating the signal that you are trying to get here. And what it gives us in the end is something that's actually pretty akin to fMRI. We're measuring blood oxygenation and flow in the same way. We're just doing it using these scalp sensors, right? So I don't have results to show you yet, but our sort of early preliminary results suggest that this will actually work. We're getting something here that is starting to function. Essentially, we're doing the same converter approach here. So we're fitting converters from the DOT data to fMRI data, and then decoding using our fMRI models, and that's working pretty well. So this is me inside one of their DOT machines. They also are working on miniaturized versions of this that are essentially just a helmet that you can wear and walk around with, which is getting to the point that this could actually be a practical thing that people could use, right? So yeah, let me wrap up here, and I want to say a little bit about sort of the where this is going to go also. So kind of big picture, we're using this experimental approach in these neural network models to better understand how language is represented in the brain, to map these representations across the cortex, and also to decode, meaning decode semantics from the fMRI signals. We're really excited about the possibility that this could be a useful brain-computer interface tool. It's very distinct from the kinds of things that Chetan was just talking about. This is looking at semantics instead of motor. Right? We're looking at meaning instead of like intended movement. It's much more widespread in the brain, and it's something that we can get at non-invasively. So we don't have to do neurosurgery to get at sort of these signals. So it might potentially be useful for things that are a pretty different set of things, right? So the direction that we're really exploring now, and my student Jerry is now doing a postdoc with myself and Maya Henry, who's a collaborator of ours at UT, who studies aphasia, and we're trying to see if we can make this work as maybe a first step toward a speech prosthesis for expressive aphasia. So for people who can formulate ideas of what they want to say but can't turn those ideas into words, this might be a tool that could potentially help them express themselves. So this is a direction that we're really excited about, and yeah. So let me close there and thank the people who did all this work, because I'm just a professor, I don't do anything anymore, especially my students Shaylee and Jerry, everyone else in my lab. We have a bunch of lovely grad students and undergrads, collaborators all over the place, especially Maya Henry, who we're working with on the aphasia, and our WashU collaborators, Joe Culver and his student Morgan Fogarty, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Alex and Chetan. We have time for one quick question, and then we're going to take a break, and we come back in here at 2:30. Question right there.
Yeah, thanks for the wonderful talk. For expressive aphasia or locked-in syndrome, what if you displayed the result on the screen and the patient could modify the way they are thinking in order to iterate to the concept that they're trying to get out?
Yeah, that's something we're really excited about. So this is something that's been shown a lot with motor decoding, that if you close the loop, if you show the subject what the output is, then it gets much better. Like, it turns out we are much better than these machine learning models at adapting, right? We're much better at adapting to the machine learning models than they are at adapting to us. So we're really hopeful that that's a thing that could improve the performance of this decoding. We're getting it working in real time right now. Hopefully in the next month or so, we'll have some answers for you. But yeah, thank you.
Let's thank the speaker one more time.